The station was nearly empty, save for the few passengers scattered across the platform, waiting for the last train of the night. Sarah stood by the platform's edge, her gaze lost in the blur of the rain streaking down from the sky. The cold December air wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, but it wasn't the chill of the weather that made her shiver, it was the weight of her decision. Returning to her hometown after all these years felt like stepping backward into a life she had long left behind. She had built a new one in the city, far from the memories of her parents, far from the echoes of a failed marriage. But the past had a way of creeping back, no matter how many miles you put between it and yourself. She glanced at her watch. The train would be arriving any minute now. The sound of the approaching locomotive grew louder, its distant rumble like a warning, stirring something in her chest. She hadn't come here for closure, she wasn't ready for that yet. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to face what had been left undone. As the train pulled into the station, she heard the sharp screech of the wheels against the tracks, a noise that seemed to mirror her thoughts. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform, ready to board. The train doors slid open with a soft hiss, and she hesitated for a moment. Then, with a swift motion, Sarah climbed aboard. The train was mostly empty, save for a few late-night travelers. She found a seat by the window, settling into the solitude of the compartment. Across the aisle, a man sat, his eyes focused on something distant outside. He didn't look at her as she sat down, but there was something about him. Something that made her wonder why he, too, was on this late-night journey. The train lurched forward, its steady rhythm vibrating through the floor, and Sarah let herself relax into the seat. The night was dark outside, the countryside rolling by in a blur. Her thoughts were still tangled, but the motion of the train offered a small comfort, a sense of detachment from the chaos of her life. The man across from her hadn't moved. He stared out the window, his profile casting shadows in the dim light of the compartment. There was something about him, something familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. His brow was furrowed, his lips set in a line that suggested deep thought, or perhaps sorrow. Sarah turned her gaze away, focusing on the rhythmic thump of the train wheels against the tracks. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a strange pull toward this stranger. Maybe it was the quiet solitude of the night, or the way he seemed so lost in his own world, just as she was. After a few moments, he shifted in his seat, breaking the silence between them. "Do you mind if I sit here?" His voice was low, steady. It wasn't a question, more of a quiet invitation. Sarah blinked in surprise, not sure if he was addressing her. When she looked up, she saw him gesturing to the seat next to her. "Sorry," he added, almost as if realizing how strange it sounded. "I'm just trying to get a little distance." She nodded, unsure of how to respond. He slid into the seat beside her, and the space between them shrank, though neither of them spoke. The train seemed to hum louder now, the sound of it filling the space as Sarah continued to watch the world outside, her thoughts drifting. "Where are you headed?" His voice broke the silence again, and this time, Sarah looked over at him. "To the city," she said quietly, surprised by the words. It had been so long since she'd said them aloud. "What about you?" The man hesitated before answering, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I'm going home," he said simply. The train rumbled through the night, and the soft hum of the wheels seemed to pull Sarah deeper into the silence. She hadn't planned to talk to this stranger, this man who was now sitting beside her. But there was something about him, something that made her feel like she wasn't so alone in this moment. She glanced at him again. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. There was a quiet sadness in his posture, like the weight of years was pressing down on him. His eyes looked distant, as if he was searching for something beyond the landscape of the speeding train. "Home," Sarah repeated, almost to herself. It was a word that felt heavy on her tongue. For her, it was a place she had run from, a place that had once held warmth but had become nothing more than a reminder of what she had lost. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The man didn't seem to be in a hurry to speak, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you come back often?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. He turned to her slowly, his gaze meeting hers. There was a brief pause before he spoke. "Not as often as I should," he admitted, his voice carrying a weight that matched the look in his eyes. It's hard, you know? Going back to a place where everything has changed, but nothing really has. Sarah's chest tightened. She could feel his words echoing in her own heart. She understood that feeling all too well. The last time she had come back to this town, everything had been different. Her parents were gone, and the small house she had once called home was now just a hollow shell of memories. "I haven't been back in years," she said, her voice catching. "I didn't think I could handle it." The man nodded, his eyes softening with understanding. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you have to face the past to move forward." The steady rhythm of the train suddenly faltered, the smooth hum turning into an unsettling jolt that reverberated through the entire carriage. Sarah felt the abrupt stop before she heard it, a screeching sound, followed by a brief silence, and then the train came to a halt. Confusion rippled through the passengers, a murmur of voices rising in the air as the lights flickered overhead. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. She glanced at the man beside her, who was already standing and moving toward the aisle. His face was set, but there was something weary in his eyes. "We've broken down," he muttered, almost as though speaking to himself, but Sarah heard him clearly. She felt an unexpected pang of unease at the disruption. The journey had been a quiet one until now, and this sudden pause felt like a break in the fragile illusion of peace she had managed to hold on to. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, confirming the news. The train had suffered a mechanical failure, and they would be delayed indefinitely. As passengers began to gather their belongings, some chatting nervously, others settling back into their seats, Sarah felt the pull of a strange, unsettling stillness. The night air outside was cold, and the station platform, barely lit, felt miles away. David, the man beside her, was already stepping toward the door, glancing back toward Sarah. "Want to stretch your legs?" he asked, his tone casual, but she could sense the unease in his voice. Without a word, Sarah followed him. They stepped off the train, the cool air hitting her face and instantly clearing her head. The isolation of the small station only deepened the silence between them, but somehow, standing next to him, she didn't feel quite as alone. They both stood for a moment, looking at the distant horizon, where the dark line of trees cut into the night sky. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, breaking the quiet. David nodded, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Yeah. But sometimes, the unexpected moments are the ones that make us realize what we've been running from." The air was sharp with cold as the train, at last, began to move again. The long pause had left Sarah unsettled, but there was something oddly comforting about the motion returning. The train's rhythmic movement felt like the world was in motion once more, pushing forward. Much like the thoughts in Sarah's mind. David had returned to his seat, but they hadn't spoken much since stepping back onto the train. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond forged not by words, but by shared silence and the night's strange turn of events. Sarah stared out of the window, the blurred landscape now reflecting the tumult in her own heart. She had come here, to this place, because she thought she needed closure. But now, in the stillness of the train, she realized that closure wasn't something to be found at a destination. It wasn't tied to a place, it was something she needed to find within herself. David's voice broke through her thoughts, soft and steady. "You know, I think we can always go home. But it's what we choose to do with it that matters." Sarah turned to look at him, surprised by the weight of his words. He wasn't looking at her, but his expression was thoughtful, distant. "I'm not sure what that means for me," she admitted quietly, the vulnerability in her voice raw. "But I want to believe it's true." David nodded slowly. "It's never easy. But sometimes, we just need a push to see things differently." As the train continued on its journey, Sarah realized that maybe this was the moment she needed to step into something new. The past, no matter how much she wanted to run from it, would always be a part of her. But perhaps, in this shared space with David, she could learn to move forward. The train pulled into her hometown, its familiar lights welcoming her, but this time, Sarah felt a shift. She wasn't returning to the past. She was going home, with the possibility of starting anew. David stood up as the train came to a halt, and as he met her eyes, there was a silent understanding between them. No words were necessary. "I'll walk with you," he said, and Sarah smiled, a new sense of peace settling in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt ready to face whatever came next.